My name is Peyton Ramirez, and I was 30 years old the afternoon I stood in my apartment holding my 3-day-old son, staring into a room that had been robbed by my own mother. The hospital had just discharged us. My arms ached from the weight of the infant carrier. I pushed open the door to the nursery, expecting the smell of fresh sage paint and the sight of the oak bassinet my coworkers had pooled their money to buy. Instead, the room echoed. The bassinet was gone. The tower of diapers my aunts had stacked in the corner was missing. The changing table sat bare, stripped of its padded mat. A circular indentation on the carpet marked the exact spot where the diaper pail used to sit. 2 days earlier, while I was receiving stitches and learning how to feed my child, my mother had let herself in with her spare key. She didn't come to dust or drop off casseroles. She came to pack up every single gift from my baby shower and return them for cash. All so she could buy my 28-year-old sister a plane ticket to a luxury beach resort. What happened 4 months later in a Nebraska farmhouse when a flashy estate lawyer realized the trap my grandmother had quietly set is something my mother still refuses to talk about. But I will. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance. This is the place where we share stories of women who stop absorbing the damage and start holding the receipts. If you know what it feels like to be the family safety net, drop a comment, tell me how old you are, and hit subscribe so you never miss a lesson in setting boundaries. The afternoon I found the empty nursery, I didn't drop the infant carrier. I didn't scream. When you spend your days working as a financial planner, analyzing market risk, and mitigating disaster, panic is a luxury you learn to schedule for later. I set Leo gently on the living room rug. I stepped back into the hallway and dialed my mother on FaceTime. Sylvia answered on the second ring. The mechanical whir of a blender hummed through the phone speaker. She wore a bright floral blouse and a fresh blowout. "You are home," she chirped. "Where is the nursery furniture, Mom?" I kept my voice flat, conversational. She waved a hand dismissively, carrying her phone into the kitchen. "Oh, honey, I took those things back yesterday. I held on to the gift receipts from the shower, remember? I told you it was just in case of duplicates. You returned the bed my son sleeps in. He is a newborn Peyton. Put him in a laundry basket for a few days. He won't know the difference. Babies don't remember." A practiced heavy sigh crackled through the speaker. Harper is going through a very dark period. That breakup took a toll on her spirit. She needed a wellness retreat in Tulum to reset. I used the store credit to help cover her flights. Family takes care of family. I listened to the ice crushing in her blender. My sister was about to sip tequila on a Mexican beach funded by her nephew's stolen diapers. Sylvia kept talking, detailing Harper's itinerary, oblivious to the silence on my end. But my eyes caught movement in the background of the video frame. Sitting on the edge of Sylvia's living room sofa was my grandmother, Helen. Helen lived 2 towns over and rarely visited my parents. She sat rigid, wearing her usual wool cardigan. She didn't speak to defend me. She didn't interrupt Sylvia. Helen just stared directly into the camera lens, holding a silver pen in her arthritic hand, writing something down in a small, black leather notebook. "Don't be rigid about this," Peyton Sylvia was saying. "Just be a team player." "I have to go," I said. I tapped the screen and cut the feed. Crying to a thief yields nothing. I walked to the hall closet, pulled out a second-hand pack-and-play I had purchased myself at a garage sale, and locked the plastic joints into place. Then I pulled up a local directory on my phone. "Yes, I need a locksmith at my apartment," I told the dispatcher. "Cylinder swaps on all external doors. Today." I set my phone on the kitchen counter and watched Leo sleep in his makeshift bed. My mother thought she had solved her favorite daughter's crisis by treating my home like a bank account. She assumed I would swallow the loss the way I always did. She didn't know I spent my living tracking deficits. And she definitely didn't know what Helen was writing in that little black book. 3 a.m. is a lonely hour for any new mother. For me, it was illuminated by the harsh blue glare of my phone screen. I sat in a faded rocking chair I had found on a neighborhood marketplace page, swaying back and forth to keep Leo asleep. My shoulder muscles burned. The pack-and-play squeaked with every shift of his tiny weight. My thumb hovered over a notification. Harper had just uploaded a new photo carousel to Instagram. I opened the app. The first image was a masterclass in curated luxury. Harper reclined on a teak lounge chair beside a slate gray infinity pool. She wore a pristine white linen cover-up, holding a frosted glass filled with a pale pink cocktail, a lime wheel balanced perfectly on the rim. The geotag stamped her location at an exclusive beachfront resort in Tulum. I swiped to the next slide, a video clip of the ocean waves crashing against a private cabana. Then a selfie of Harper, looking serene and sun-kissed. I read the caption, "Blessed with the best parents who know exactly what I need to heal, surrounding myself with good energy and gratitude." A sharp ping broke the quiet of the nursery. A text message dropped down from the top of my screen. It was Sylvia. "Did you see your sister's post? Go like it and leave a nice comment. We want Aunt Linda and the cousins to see that everyone is supporting her recovery." I stared at the words. Sylvia was not just asking for my silence regarding the stolen nursery furniture. She was demanding my active public complicity. In my family, reality was whatever Sylvia managed to project to our extended relatives. If I liked the photo, I endorsed the narrative. If I endorsed the narrative, the theft never happened. It was just a mother helping her wounded daughter, while her older daughter smiled and applauded from the sidelines. For a brief second, the familiar heat of injustice flared in my chest. The urge to type a blistering reply, to take a screenshot of the empty corner where the bassinet used to sit and post it in the family group chat, was a physical ache. But my professional instincts kicked in. I manage wealth for a living. I build portfolios, project market downturns, and protect assets from volatile forces. You do not negotiate with a volatile force. You document its path of destruction. I set the phone face down on the side table. I did not like the photo. I did not reply to the text. Instead, I carefully stood up, walked to my home office desk, and opened my laptop. If Sylvia thought the digital trail vanished just because she walked out of a baby boutique with cash in hand, she was mistaken. I logged into the back end of my online baby registry. The system tracks every item purchased, who bought it, and its current fulfillment status. I clicked over to the Returns and Exchanges tab. The screen populated with a long, detailed ledger. It was a digital graveyard of my baby shower. Row after row, the data told the story. Sylvia had not just returned the large items, she had been methodical. She returned the organic cotton swaddles my college roommates sent. She returned the infant bathtub. She even returned a set of silicone teething rings that cost $14. The timestamps showed she had spent an hour and a half at the customer service desk processing each item individually. I opened a blank spreadsheet. I titled it Leo. I began entering the data. Column A, the item description. Column B, the original purchaser. Column C, the transaction ID. Column D, the exact dollar amount refunded. I worked in silence for 40 minutes. The rhythmic clatter of my keyboard was the only sound in the apartment. When I finished, I tallied the bottom row, $1,247.63. That was the price tag on Harper's healing journey. I hit print. The machine hummed and pushed out 2 crisp sheets of paper. I folded them, placed them inside a plain manila folder, and slid the folder into the top drawer of my desk. Then I executed the hardest part of any tactical defense. I went dark. Over the next 48 hours, my phone buzzed with subtle provocations. Harper posted more photos. Sylvia sent a group text about how much the ocean air was helping my sister's aura. I ignored all of it. I did not answer calls. I did not send passive-aggressive emojis. I played the role they expected me to play, the submissive, defeated workhorse who had accepted her place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. This radio silence was a calculated maneuver. It made Sylvia comfortable. When you stop fighting back, predators assume you have surrendered. They drop their guard. Sylvia assumed I was too exhausted by motherhood to raise a defense. She was right about the exhaustion. She was wrong about the defense. 2 days later, at 10 in the morning, a sharp knock rattled my apartment door. I checked the video doorbell feed. Helen stood on the welcome mat. She wore her signature wool cardigan despite the mild Nebraska weather, her silver hair pulled back into a severe knot. She was alone. Her posture was rigid, her jaw set tight. I unlatched the new deadbolt and pulled the door open. "You changed the locks," Helen said. It was not a question. Her sharp eyes darted from the shiny brass fixture to my face. "I did." She gave a single, curt nod. "Good." She walked past me into the apartment, her sensible leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Helen was not a woman who traded in warm hugs or soft platitudes. She had survived a hard life on a Nebraska farm, outliving my grandfather, and running 400 acres of commercial agriculture leases with an iron fist. She did not offer me a sympathetic smile or a canned apology for her daughter's behavior. She dropped her heavy purse onto the kitchen island. "Brew a pot of coffee, Peyton." "Cream or sugar?" I asked, pulling a mug from the cabinet. "Black and bitter," she replied, her voice rough like dry leaves. "Just how we like our truth." I started the coffee maker. The rich, dark scent filled the kitchen. Helen did not wait for the brew to finish. She turned and walked directly down the hall toward the nursery. I followed a few steps behind. I watched her stand in the doorway, taking in the sparse room. Her eyes scanned the squeaky second-hand pack-and-play, the folded blankets stacked on a plastic storage bin instead of a changing table, the empty corner where the bassinet should have rested. She stood there for a long time, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I could see the muscles in her jaw working. She turned back to face me. The expression in her eyes was something I had never seen directed at my mother before. It was a quiet, unyielding disgust. "Give me the number," Helen said. I tilted my head. "Which number?" "Do not play coy with me, Peyton. You are a financial planner. I know you did not just sit here and weep. I know you calculated the deficit. What is the exact dollar amount your mother walked out of this apartment with?" I turned around, walked into my home office, and opened the top drawer of my desk. I pulled out the manila folder and carried it back to the nursery. I slid the printed spreadsheet out and handed it to her. Helen put on her reading glasses. She read every single line. She read the transaction IDs. She read the names of the aunts and coworkers who had purchased the gifts. She followed the column of numbers all the way down to the bottom right corner, $1,247.63. She folded the spreadsheet neatly into thirds. She tucked it into the inside pocket of her heavy leather purse and snapped the brass clasp shut. The sound echoed in the empty room. Helen looked at me. Her expression was wiped clean of any familial warmth. She looked like a CEO preparing to liquidate a failing subsidiary. "Put the baby in his car seat," she instructed, her tone brooking zero argument. "Where are we going?" I asked. Helen adjusted the strap of her purse over her shoulder. "Grab your keys, Peyton. We are going for a drive downtown. I need to see a lawyer, and you need to drive the getaway car." I navigated the interstate toward downtown Omaha with my grandmother sitting in the passenger seat. She kept her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the endless stretch of concrete ahead. She did not offer an explanation for our destination. I did not push for one. When you are summoned by a woman who built a commercial farming operation from dirt and sheer willpower, you simply drive the car. We pulled into the parking garage of an imposing glass and steel high-rise. The directory in the lobby listed Sterling & Associates on the 14th floor. I recognized the name immediately. Within Nebraska agricultural circles, Margaret Sterling possessed a terrifying reputation. She was the estate attorney wealthy families hired when they needed to dismantle generational disputes with surgical precision. She did not draft suggestions. She built legal fortresses. Helen stepped off the elevator and turned to face me. Her expression brokered zero debate. "You stay here," she instructed. I gestured toward the glass double doors of the firm. "You do not want me to come inside and take notes?" "I need you to sit in that chair and wait," Helen replied, pointing to a leather bench in the reception area. "The things I am doing today require an independent environment. No one can ever claim you guided my hand. Do you understand?" I nodded, taking a seat. Helen pushed through the glass doors alone. For 2 hours, I sat in that quiet waiting room. The space smelled of lemon polish, expensive coffee, and old money. The receptionist typed rhythmically at her keyboard. Beyond the heavy oak doors down the hall, I could hear the muffled, rhythmic cadence of legal machinery at work. I pulled out my phone and answered a few emails from my financial planning clients, but my focus remained on the hallway. I thought about my grandmother. She had outsmarted ruthless competitors her entire life. She was not a victim. Whatever she was constructing behind those oak doors was designed to withstand a siege. The heavy door finally clicked open. Helen walked out. The rigid energy that had carried her up the elevator seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind a profound physical exhaustion. Her shoulders slumped slightly. The lines around her mouth deepened, yet her eyes remained sharp, burning with a fierce, quiet resolve. She walked over to my chair and handed me a thick manila envelope. The flap was sealed with heavy tape. "Put this in your bag," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I weighed the package in my hands. What is this? Helen placed her cold hand over mine, pressing the paper down. "Do not open this until I am gone, Peyton. Keep it in a safe place. Keep your mouth shut." I slid the envelope into the zippered compartment of my work tote. We rode the elevator down in total silence. Life has a strange way of marching forward while a bomb ticks under the floorboards. Over the next few days, Sylvia shifted her focus from her daughter's beach vacation to her next grand performance. Harper was flying back from Tulum, and Sylvia decided the occasion demanded a lavish welcome home party. The demands began arriving via text message on a Tuesday morning. Sylvia wanted me to bake a specific lemon raspberry cake. She also requested that I bring Leo early, dressed in a specific blue sweater she had gifted him before the theft. The strategy was transparent. Sylvia needed a photo op. She wanted to present our extended family with a picture of the dutiful older sister handing over the newborn to the glowing, healed younger sister. If the relatives saw us smiling over cake, any whispered rumors of tension would evaporate. She wanted to use my son as a prop to launder her own guilt. I looked at the text message while feeding Leo. My financial planner instincts calculated the cost of compliance. Attending that party meant bankrupting my self-respect. I typed a brief reply. "I will not be able to attend. Enjoy the celebration." The blowback was swift, but Sylvia did not call me herself. She never dirtied her own hands when she could dispatch a proxy. 2 hours later, my father stood outside my apartment. Because I had swapped the cylinder locks, he could not use his old key to let himself in. He was forced to press the doorbell and wait in the hallway. I opened the door, keeping the chain engaged for a brief moment before sighing and unlatching it. David Ramirez was a man who had spent 30 years paving the road for his wife's steamroller. He possessed a gentle demeanor and a chronic aversion to conflict, which meant he frequently sacrificed his eldest daughter to avoid hearing his wife complain. He stepped into my living room, avoiding my gaze. "Your mother is very stressed, Peyton," he began, rubbing the back of his neck. I rocked Leo against my chest. "She chose to host a party, Dad. Stress is the natural return on that investment." He offered a tired, pleading smile. "Harper just got back. She needs a stable environment right now. Why do you have to be so stubborn about this? Just bring the baby. Have a slice of cake. Smile for an hour. Just keep the peace." I studied my father. He looked exhausted, burdened by the constant emotional labor of managing Sylvia's reality. But his peace was purchased with my pain. He was asking me to endure humiliation so he could enjoy a quiet evening in his own house. "My peace matters too," I said, keeping my tone level. "She stole from her grandson to fund a vacation. I am not rewarding that behavior with a photo op. The answer is no." David let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "You are making a mistake, Peyton. You know how she gets." "I know exactly how she gets," I replied. "I am just not managing it for you anymore." He turned and walked out of the apartment, the door clicking shut behind him. I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest. For the first time in my life, I had drawn a line in the sand and refused to move it. That evening, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a call from Helen. "Did you tell your father no?" she asked. I did. "Good." Helen sounded breathless, her voice unusually frail over the cellular connection. "Your mother is furious. She is spinning a story to your aunts. A storm is coming, Peyton. Hold your ground. You have the envelope." "I will, Grandma. Are you feeling all right?" "I am just tired," she murmured. "I built the wall. Now I just need to rest." She hung up. I placed the phone down, feeling a sudden chill brush against my spine. I assumed her exhaustion was simply the aftermath of the intense legal meeting. I assumed we had months, perhaps years, to watch the conflict play out on our own terms. I was wrong. At 2 a.m, the harsh ringtone of my cell phone shattered the quiet of the nursery. The caller ID flashed the name of a hospital in the next county. A nurse spoke in clipped, urgent tones. Helen had suffered a severe, catastrophic stroke in her sleep. I dropped the phone on the carpet. The carefully planned timeline we had established in that downtown office building evaporated in an instant. The storm Helen warned me about was no longer a distant threat on the horizon. It was crashing through the front door, and I was holding an envelope I barely understood. The transition from a vibrant life to a sterile medical room is a cruel, quiet process. Helen was transferred to a hospice care facility on the outskirts of Omaha by sunrise. The severe stroke had left her entirely unresponsive. The vibrant, sharp-tongued woman who had commanded harvest yields and negotiated ruthless commercial leases was reduced to the rhythmic hiss of an oxygen concentrator and the slow drip of intravenous fluids. For me, the grief was a physical weight. I sat in the vinyl chair beside her bed, holding her frail, unresponsive hand, watching the rise and fall of her chest. I traced the calluses on her palms, the enduring physical evidence of a woman who had pulled a farming empire out of the Nebraska dirt. For my mother and sister, the hospice room was not a place of mourning. It was a waiting area for an administrative transfer of power. Sylvia did not sit by the bed. She stood near the window, her back to her dying mother, rapidly scrolling through her phone. Her conversations with the medical staff were brisk and stripped of any emotional depth. She asked about timelines, not treatments. She treated Helen's impending death as a logistical hurdle she needed to clear before moving on to her true objective. Helen owned 400 acres of prime agricultural land. The acreage was leased to corporate growers producing corn and soybeans, generating a staggering, reliable annual yield. Anchoring that land was a sprawling historic farmhouse built of solid oak and fieldstone. It was a multi-million-dollar corporation disguised as a rustic family homestead. And Sylvia, fueled by years of resentment over Helen's iron grip on the family finances, was ready to crown herself the new matriarch. 3 days into Helen's hospice stay, I left the facility to collect the mail at the farmhouse. The property required basic upkeep, and I wanted to ensure the pipes had not frozen in the early autumn chill. I parked my sedan at the end of the long gravel driveway. The front door was unlocked. I stepped into the foyer. The house smelled of lemon polish and aged wood, just as it always had. But underneath that familiar scent, I heard the distinct sound of heavy boots against the hardwood floor, followed by the metallic snap of a measuring tape. I walked toward the back of the house. In Helen's antique sunroom, a space filled with her prized orchids and wicker reading chairs, stood Sylvia. Beside her was a man in a canvas work jacket holding a clipboard. "We can tear down this load-bearing wall here," Sylvia was saying, gesturing toward the beautiful arched entryway. "We will install floor-to-ceiling glass panels. My daughter is a wellness instructor. She needs natural light for her yoga studio. We want a minimalist, modern aesthetic." The contractor scratched his chin with the end of his pen. "Removing that wall requires structural steel reinforcement, ma'am. It is a pricey modification. Are you the property owner?" Sylvia smiled, a bright, rehearsed expression. "My mother is in her final days. The property is transitioning into my care. We want to be ready to break ground the moment the dust settles." I stood in the doorway, my hands balling into fists at my sides. My grandmother was literally still breathing in a sterile room across town, and my mother was already measuring her sanctuary for demolition. Sylvia viewed the farmhouse not as a legacy to be preserved, but as a carcass to be picked clean. She was carving up the spoils to build a monument to Harper's vanity. "Oh, Peyton," Sylvia said, noticing me in the threshold. Her tone was light, unbothered. "I am just getting some preliminary quotes. Harper needs a dedicated space to process her trauma and build her brand. The city apartment is too cramped for her aura." Before I could formulate a response that would not betray the secret resting in my work tote, footsteps echoed down the main staircase. Harper appeared. She wore expensive athletic wear, holding a steaming cup of herbal tea. She walked past me without offering a greeting and headed straight for the vintage walnut credenza in the hallway. Mom, Harper whined, tapping her manicured nails against the wood. "Where did Grandma keep the key to the antique jewelry box? The mahogany one with the pearl inlay. You said I could have it for my vanity." I watched my sister hunt for shiny objects while the woman who bought them lay dying. Harper did not want Helen's grit or her business acumen. She wanted the superficial aesthetic of wealth. The jewelry box was merely a prop for her social media, a vintage accessory to signal a lifestyle she had never earned. "The box is in the master bedroom," I said, keeping my voice remarkably even. Harper turned a triumphant smirk forming on her lips. She took a step toward the stairs. "But the door is locked," I added. "I locked it." Harper stopped. She looked at our mother, waiting for Sylvia to intervene. "Peyton, open the door," Sylvia instructed, her voice dropping an octave. "Your sister asked for a simple keepsake. Stop being difficult." "I am here to collect the mail and check the water lines," I replied, meeting Sylvia's gaze. "The hospital called. The nurses need someone to sign the updated care directives. You should probably head back." Sylvia let out an exasperated sigh, waving the contractor off. "Fine. We will wrap this up later. Send me the estimates by Friday," she told the man. As Sylvia and the contractor walked out the front door, Harper glared at me, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "You always ruin everything," she muttered, before turning on her heel and following our mother out to the driveway. I waited until the sound of their tires crunched down the gravel road. The house fell silent again. I did not care about the antique jewelry box. I did not care about the vintage pearls or the silver brooches. I manage portfolios for a living. I know the difference between depreciating vanity assets and actual power. I walked past the locked master bedroom and entered Helen's home office. The room was dark, lined with heavy oak bookshelves. I bypassed the decorative items and went straight for the heavy steel filing cabinet tucked in the corner. I knew where Helen kept the spare key. I unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out 4 thick, leather-bound financial ledgers. These books contained the real machinery of the estate. They held the tenant lease agreements, the crop yield projections, the property tax receipts, and the routing numbers for the operational bank accounts. This was the blood pumping through the veins of the 400 acres. I slid the heavy ledgers into my work bag, nesting them right next to the sealed envelope Helen had given me outside the lawyer's office. When I returned to the hospice facility that evening, I played the fool. I sat in the corner chair looking exhausted and thoroughly defeated. I let Sylvia talk about her grand renovation plans. I let her believe I was too overwhelmed by single motherhood to care about real estate or family heirlooms. I offered no resistance. In tactical finance, you never interrupt an opponent who is busy over-leveraging their position. The limbo lasted for 2 more days. On a quiet Tuesday morning, while the autumn rain washed against the hospital windows, Helen's chest stopped rising. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine fell silent. The nurse checked her pulse, offered a solemn nod, and recorded the time of death. I stood by the bed, my vision blurring with tears. I pressed my hand against Helen's cold cheek, whispering a quiet promise into the sterile air. Across the room, Sylvia did not shed a tear. She did not approach the bed to say goodbye. She turned her back to us, pulled her cell phone from her designer handbag, and scrolled through her contacts. Before the doctor had even signed the death certificate, before the obituary was even drafted, my mother walked into the hallway and made a phone call. I listened through the open door as she authorized the contractor to order the structural steel for Harper's yoga studio. Sylvia thought she was breaking ground on her new empire. She did not realize she had just signed a binding financial contract for a property she did not own, stepping blindly into a legal trap with jaws made of iron. Helen breathed her last breath on a quiet Tuesday morning. The stroke had left her in hospice care for a brief, agonizing window of time. During those lingering days while I sat by the sterile hospital bed, listening to the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine, my mother treated the tragedy like an administrative clearinghouse. Before my grandmother's obituary even reached the local Nebraska paper, Sylvia was already walking through the historic family farmhouse with a general contractor. I had stopped by the property to collect Helen's mail and found Sylvia tapping a metal tape measure against the antique sunroom windows, discussing the demolition required to build Harper a personal yoga studio. Harper had trailed behind her, cornering me near the staircase to demand Helen's antique jewelry box, claiming she needed it for emotional comfort. I had refused, slipping past them to quietly secure Helen's actual financial ledgers inside my work tote. I played the exhausted, distracted new mother, allowing them to believe I held zero interest in the property. That illusion carried us straight into the funeral reception. The gathering took place in the basement of the local Methodist church. The space offered a stark, unglamorous backdrop for such a high-stakes social performance. Faded acoustic tiles lined the ceiling, and harsh fluorescent tubes cast an unflattering glare on the mourners. The air felt thick, heavy, with the cloying scent of white lilies and stale coffee. A long buffet table held aluminum trays of casseroles and baked goods provided by the congregation. If a funeral is meant to be a space for quiet reflection, Sylvia treated it like a campaign rally. She wore a tailored black dress that looked newly purchased, her posture radiating the bustling energy of a woman stepping into a lucrative promotion. I took a seat in the back row of plastic folding chairs, keeping Leo securely fastened to my chest in his fabric carrier. From my vantage point, the entire room functioned as a stage, and I was the sole audience member aware of the script. Sylvia glided from group to group, offering practiced, sorrowful smiles. I watched her target the commercial farm tenants. These were men with calloused hands and sun-weathered faces who leased the 400 acres of prime agricultural land my grandmother owned. They looked uncomfortable in their dark suits, holding their paper plates awkwardly near their chests. Sylvia approached a man named Thomas, a third-generation corn grower who had leased from Helen for 2 decades. He twisted the brim of his faded work cap in his large hands. The dirt beneath his fingernails stood in stark contrast to Sylvia's flawless manicure. She placed a hand on his forearm. I could hear her voice carrying over the low hum of the crowd. "I know Helen was tough on you boys," Sylvia said, offering a conspiratorial nod. "But you do not need to worry about the upcoming planting season. The family is running the estate now. I will be reviewing all the lease agreements next week. We are going to modernize the operation." Thomas shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the floor. "Yes, ma'am. We just want to pay our respects to Helen. She was a fair woman." Sylvia patted his arm again, missing the tension in his rigid shoulders. "Things will be much smoother now, Thomas. Just call my cell phone on Monday." She was negotiating contracts over a casket. She was claiming dominion over land she had never worked, spending social capital she did not possess. Across the room, Harper had established her own theater. She had positioned a portable ring light in the corner near the floral arrangements. She stood in front of her smartphone camera, adjusting the collar of her dark designer dress. She pressed record and began speaking to her digital followers, wiping away a single, carefully orchestrated tear. I watched her frame the shot to ensure the memorial wreaths were visible in the background. She was documenting her grief journey for strangers, monetizing a funeral to maintain the engagement metrics she had cultivated on her Tulum vacation. I remained in my plastic chair. I did not mingle. I did not correct the narrative. I rocked my son and let the data compile. Sylvia eventually noticed my stillness. She needed me to participate in the performance to validate her role as the grieving matriarch supported by her devoted daughters. When I refused to play my part, she pivoted her strategy. She began laying the groundwork to isolate me. She drifted toward the coffee urns where my Aunt Linda and Aunt Susan were standing. I watched Sylvia lean in close, lowering her voice just enough to invite curiosity, but keeping it loud enough to ensure the surrounding guests caught the tone of her distress. I just do not know what to do about Peyton." Sylvia sighed, pressing a tissue to her dry cheek. "She has been so cold, so distant. I ask her to help me arrange the floral deliveries, and she just sits there with the baby." Aunt Linda cast a disapproving glance in my direction. "People grieve in their own way, Sylvia, but she really should be supporting you right now. You have too much on your plate." "It breaks my heart," Sylvia continued, shaking her head. "Harper is falling apart, and Peyton will not even offer her sister a hug. It is like she does not care that her grandmother is gone. She only cares about herself." The seed was planted. Sylvia was preemptively discrediting me, painting me as the selfish, uncooperative daughter. If I challenged her authority later, the family would already be conditioned to view my actions as an extension of my supposed coldness. The reception began to thin out. The church volunteers started wrapping the leftover casseroles in foil. Sylvia realized she was running out of an audience. She needed to secure the next phase of her plan before the extended family dispersed back to their respective homes. She spotted me standing near the coat rack, preparing to leave. She marched across the linoleum floor, her heels clicking a sharp, urgent rhythm. Aunt Linda and Aunt Susan trailed closely behind her, eager to witness the interaction. Sylvia stopped 2 feet in front of me. She did not look at Leo. She did not ask how I was holding up. She extended her right hand, palm facing up, an unmistakable gesture of authority. "I need the farmhouse keys, Peyton," she demanded. Her voice held the crisp, impatient edge of a manager addressing a subordinate. I adjusted the strap of my diaper bag. I looked at her outstretched hand, then up to her face. "Which keys?" "Do not play games today," Sylvia snapped, glancing back at my aunts to ensure they were registering my supposed defiance. "The brass keys to the farmhouse. Helen kept a spare set on the hook by the kitchen door, and I know you went over there yesterday to get the mail. I need them right now. Harper needs to move some of her things into the sunroom this weekend so she can start finding closure in a familiar space." Aunt Linda nodded in agreement, crossing her arms over her chest. "Give your mother the keys, Peyton. Let your sister heal." The trap was set. They expected me to argue. They wanted me to raise my voice, to clutch my bag defensively, to prove the narrative Sylvia had just spent an hour building. They wanted the selfish daughter to throw a tantrum in a church basement. For 30 years, this was the exact moment I would fold. I would hand over whatever object, sum of money, or piece of dignity they demanded, simply to avoid a scene. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I maintained the exact same neutral, professional tone I used when informing a client their risky stock bet had tanked. "I do not have the keys, Mom," I said smoothly. Sylvia frowned, her hands still hovering in the space between us. "Then where are they?" "I passed them over to the estate attorney yesterday afternoon." Sylvia blinked. "The attorney? What attorney?" "Helen used some online legal service years ago. Dad is calling a probate judge on Monday to sort it out." I shook my head, keeping my expression perfectly serene. "No, Helen retained private counsel a few months ago. The firm is managing the transition of all real estate and financial assets." Sylvia let her hand drop to her side. The muscles in her neck tightened. "Who is the lawyer, Peyton?" "Ms. Sterling," I replied. "Margaret Sterling. Her office handles the keys now. If Harper wants access to the property, you will need to submit a formal request through her firm." The color drained from Sylvia's face, leaving her skin an ashen, chalky gray. In the tight-knit community of Nebraska agriculture, Margaret Sterling was a name that commanded instant, chilling recognition. She was not a small-town probate clerk. She was a legal predator who dismantled family disputes with ruthless efficiency. Aunt Linda gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Even the aunts knew what that name implied. It meant the estate was locked behind a steel vault, and Sylvia was currently standing on the outside. Sylvia stared at me, the polished veneer of the grieving matriarch cracking down the center. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She realized in that freezing moment that her unhindered sprint toward my grandmother's wealth had just hit a brick wall. I gave her a polite, tight smile, turned my back, and walked out the glass doors of the church into the bright, unforgiving afternoon sun. Sylvia was panicking, and a panicking woman makes desperate choices. The drive back to my apartment after the funeral reception was quiet. Leo slept in his car seat, the rhythmic hum of the tires lulling him into a deep rest. I kept the radio off. I needed the silence. Dropping Margaret Sterling's name in that church basement was the equivalent of pulling a fire alarm in a crowded theater. I knew the ensuing chaos would not be contained to whispered gossip. Sylvia operated on a singular principle. If she could not control the asset, she would destroy the obstacle standing in her way. I was the obstacle. The assault began before I even unbuckled Leo from his harness. My phone vibrated in my purse, a harsh, continuous buzzing that signaled a coordinated attack. I carried my son inside, laid him in the pack-and-play, and retrieved my device. The lock screen was buried under a cascade of notifications. The extended family group chat, a digital space normally reserved for holiday recipes and birthday reminders, had morphed into a tribunal. Sylvia had wasted no time. While I was driving home, she had mobilized her audience. She could not access the farmhouse, so she aimed her crosshairs at my reputation. I opened the chat thread. The messages read like a synchronized prosecution. Aunt Susan had fired the opening shot. "I cannot believe you would withhold the house keys from your own mother, Peyton. Helen would be ashamed." Cousin Greg chimed in next. "Harper is devastated. You know she needs a safe space to heal right now. Why are you making this about you?" Then came the narrative Sylvia had carefully engineered. Aunt Linda delivered the killing blow. "We know things are tight for you right now as a single mom, Peyton, but trying to hijack your sister's inheritance to cover your own expenses is a new low. Do not be greedy. Harper needs that house for her mental health. You already have an apartment." I stared at the glowing screen. Sylvia was a master of distortion. She had taken my refusal to hand over a stolen brass key and weaponized my status as a single mother. In her version of reality, I was the desperate, financially unstable daughter plotting a legal coup to steal my sister's rightful sanctuary. She was projecting her own greed directly onto my shoulders, using Harper's fabricated fragility as a shield. The group chat was only the first wave. My phone vibrated again, a direct text message from an unfamiliar number. "Hi, Peyton. This is Mark from the Rotary Club. Your mother mentioned you might be struggling to manage your practice with the new baby. Just wanted to check in. If you need to offload some client portfolios, let me know." The air in my lungs turned to ice. Sylvia was not just attacking my standing within the family. She was going after my livelihood. She was planting seeds of doubt within the local community, hinting to extended relatives and Rotary Club members that my financial planning firm was floundering. In the wealth management industry, trust is the only currency that matters. If clients believed I was desperate or unstable, they would pull their accounts. Sylvia was attempting to burn down my career to force me into financial submission. She calculated that a panicked, bankrupt daughter would quickly hand over an estate to save herself. The old Peyton would have engaged. The old Peyton would have typed a frantic defensive paragraph in the group chat, pleading with my aunts to understand, begging for them to see my side of the story. I would have called Sylvia crying, asking her why she was doing this. I would have played by the rules of her game, validating her power by fighting against it. I did not type a single word. I walked into my home office, sat down at my desk, and opened a new folder on my encrypted hard drive. I labeled it Discovery. I picked up my phone and began taking screenshots. I captured Aunt Susan's accusation. I captured Cousin Greg's guilt trip. I captured Aunt Linda's text calling me a greedy, desperate single mother. I captured the message from the Rotary Club member. I documented every single attack, creating a pristine digital ledger of their harassment. I was treating my family the same way I treated a hostile corporate takeover. I gathered the evidence, secured the data, and let the perpetrators continue digging their own graves. They wanted a fight. I gave them a void. The silence infuriated Sylvia. Deprived of a target to strike, she escalated her reckless behavior. If she could not legally possess the farmhouse, she would act as though the law did not apply to her. Later that afternoon, a notification chimed on my email. It was from Margaret Sterling's office. The subject line read, "Official Notice of Probate Reading." I opened the document. Ms. Sterling had scheduled the formal reading of Helen's will for Friday morning. The email included a standard legal brief outlining the procedure. I forwarded the notice to my father's email address, fulfilling my legal obligation as the designated executor. 10 minutes later, a text message arrived from Sylvia. "We received the notice from your little lawyer. Dad and I have retained our own counsel. We know exactly what you are trying to pull, Peyton. You cannot manipulate a sick old woman and expect to get away with it. See you on Friday." I read the message twice. Sylvia was bluffing. She had to be. Helen had built an airtight legal fortress, and any competent attorney would recognize that challenging Margaret Sterling was a fool's errand. But Sylvia's arrogance was a blinding force. She genuinely believed her own narrative. She believed that because she was the matriarch, the law would bend to accommodate her entitlement. I leaned back in my desk chair, processing the timeline. It was Wednesday afternoon. The reading was Friday morning. Sylvia had 48 hours to maintain her illusion of control. My phone buzzed again, interrupting my thoughts. It was a call from Thomas, the commercial corn grower I had observed at the funeral reception. I answered on the first ring. Peyton Thomas said, his voice tight with frustration. "I am sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know what is happening out at the property." I grabbed a notepad. "Tell me, Thomas. Your mother is out here with a demolition crew. They are unloading a dumpster onto the north pasture. She signed a work order to tear down the sunroom tomorrow morning. She told the foreman she has full authority to authorize the renovations." I froze my pen, hovering over the paper. Sylvia was not just bluffing via text message. She was signing binding construction contracts. She was authorizing demolition on a property she did not own, using money she did not possess, based entirely on the assumption that she would break my resolve before Friday. She had crossed the line from emotional manipulation into actionable fraud. "Thomas," I said, keeping my voice steady, "do not let that crew touch the farmhouse. I am calling the sheriff's department right now to report a trespass." "Thank you, Peyton. I did not want to cause trouble, but she is acting crazy out here." I hung up the phone. Sylvia was accelerating her timeline, desperate to alter the physical structure of the estate before the legal reality could stop her. She was throwing punches in the dark, hoping to land a decisive blow. She could not access the farmhouse. She could not provoke me into an argument. Her smear campaign was hitting a wall of silence. I knew her next move. If she could not break me digitally or legally, she would try to break me physically. She would not wait for Friday. She would bring the war directly to my front door. The Thursday afternoon sun offered a harsh glare as I drove back from the daycare center. Leo was safely buckled in the back seat, napping through the stop-and-go city traffic. I had spent the morning neutralizing the crisis out at the farmhouse, coordinating with the local sheriff to halt Sylvia's unauthorized demolition crew. The deputies had turned the contractors away, citing a lack of proper permits and the absence of the legal property owner. I knew that intervention had humiliated my mother. I also knew a humiliated predator is a dangerous one. I pulled into the parking garage of my apartment building and secured my vehicle. I gathered my tote bag, hoisted the heavy infant carrier, and made my way toward the elevator bank. My shoulders ached. The physical toll of the past week was settling deep into my bones, a creeping lethargy that begged for a hot shower and a quiet evening. The elevator doors chimed and parted on my floor. I stepped out onto the patterned carpet of the hallway. I stopped walking. Standing 10 feet away, camped directly outside my apartment door, were my father and my sister. They had clearly expected to be sitting on my living room sofa by now. Before the baby shower theft, David possessed a spare key to my deadbolt. He had clearly tried to use it, only to discover the shiny new cylinder the locksmith had installed days earlier. Denied entry, they were forced to wait in the sterile corridor, exposed and frustrated. I assessed their postures the same way I evaluate a volatile market trend. David leaned against the wallpaper, looking aged and weathered. He wore a wrinkled beige windbreaker, his shoulders slumped in a posture of manufactured exhaustion. Harper stood beside him, a sharp contrast in her expensive athleisure wear. She still carried the golden tan from her Tulum vacation. Her expression was tight, her eyes scanning me with a calculated gleam. They did not bring a casserole. They did not bring apologies. David held a slim leather portfolio tucked under his left arm. I tightened my grip on the infant carrier and closed the distance between us. I did not unlock my door. I stood in the corridor, keeping the physical barrier of the hallway intact. "What are you doing here, Dad?" I kept my voice steady, my tone stripped of any familial warmth. David offered a tired, pleading smile, stepping forward to bridge the gap. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "We just want to talk, Peyton. Your mother is falling apart. I am trying to hold this family together, and I need your help." He was deploying the peacemaker strategy. For my entire life, David had played the role of the reasonable mediator, the exhausted father, just trying to navigate the turbulent waters of his wife's demands. It was a highly effective tactic because it weaponized my empathy. He relied on my instinct to ease his burden, even if it meant multiplying my own. I shifted my weight, shielding Leo from their view. "You tried to use your old key." David cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to the floor for a fraction of a second. "I wanted to drop off some paperwork, make things easier for everyone." He unzipped the leather portfolio and placed it on the narrow wooden console table situated next to my door frame. He pulled out a crisp stack of legal-sized paper and smoothed it flat. I glanced down at the bold heading printed at the top of the page: "Voluntary renunciation of executor rights and waiver of claim." David pulled a silver pen from his pocket and laid it next to the document. "Just sign it, Peyton," he murmured, his voice adopting a low, soothing cadence. "Let your mother manage the estate. She knows what Helen wanted. Harper needs the stability of the farm right now. She needs a sanctuary to heal from her trauma. If you just sign this paper, all the fighting stops. We can go back to being a normal family." I looked at the printed words. They had visited a notary. They had paid an attorney to draft a formal surrender. They expected me to stand in a public hallway holding my sleeping son and sign away my inheritance to purchase a temporary ceasefire. A familiar scent drifted through the corridor: coconut and expensive vanilla, Harper's signature perfume. I shifted my attention to my sister. Harper had not spoken a single word since I stepped off the elevator. She stood slightly behind our father, her body angled toward the wall. Her hands were resting near her hips. I narrowed my eyes, observing the subtle tension in her stance. She was holding her smartphone. The device was pressed tight against her thigh, but the camera lens was clearly exposed, aimed directly at my face. The screen cast a faint, telltale glow against the dark fabric of her leggings. The strategy materialized in my mind with chilling clarity. This was a trap. Sylvia had sent them here to break my silence. The family group chat was waiting for proof of my instability. David was delivering the provocation, hoping to trigger my outrage. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to slap the pen away, to shout about the stolen bassinet, to hurl insults at my sister. If I raised my voice, Harper would capture the footage. Sylvia would circulate the video to the aunts, the cousins, and the Rotary Club. She would present undeniable digital evidence of the unhinged, hostile daughter attacking her poor, exhausted father in a public hallway. They wanted a meltdown. I drew a slow, deep breath, anchoring my heart rate. I accessed the professional reserve I utilized during hostile client mediations. I let my face go entirely blank, a mask of smooth, impenetrable ice. I did not reach for the pen. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I looked Harper directly in the eyes. "You are holding your device at a terrible angle," I said. "The acoustics in this hallway are awful. You will barely pick up the audio." Harper flinched. Her shoulders went rigid. I offered a small, polite smile and pointed my index finger upward, gesturing toward the top corner of my doorframe. "If you want a clear shot for the family group chat, you should request the footage from my security system." David and Harper followed my finger. Mounted flush against the molding was a brand new video doorbell camera. A glowing blue ring circled the lens, indicating it was actively recording both high-definition video and crisp audio. I had requested the installation the same afternoon I hired the locksmith. The color vanished from Harper's face. Her artificial tan seemed to fade into a sickly shade of gray. She realized instantly that her secret recording was entirely compromised. Any edited out-of-context video she produced would be effortlessly debunked by my continuous unedited security footage. The trap had collapsed onto the hunters. Harper hastily shoved the smartphone deep into the pocket of her jacket, taking a swift step backward toward the elevator bank. David stared at the glowing blue ring. The tired, reasonable peacemaker facade dissolved, sliding off his face to reveal the bitter, desperate man hiding underneath. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. He snatched the renunciation document off the console table and shoved it back into the leather portfolio, the zipper catching loudly in the quiet corridor. "You think you are so clever," David sneered, his voice dropping the gentle cadence and taking on a cruel, serrated edge. "You think changing a lock and installing a camera makes you untouchable." I pulled my key from my pocket and slid it into the deadbolt. "It makes me secure, Dad. There is a difference." He stepped closer, invading my personal space, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "You have no idea what is coming for you, Peyton. Your mother is not going to let a greedy little girl steal what belongs to this family. We have our own lawyer now, a real bulldog. Sylvia is going to destroy you in front of everyone on Friday. She will strip you down to nothing." He did not wait for a response. He turned on his heel and marched toward the elevator, Harper practically running to keep pace with his angry strides. The metal doors opened, swallowed them whole, and slid shut, leaving the hallway to its original silence. I pushed my door open, stepped inside my apartment, and engaged the heavy deadbolt. I carried Leo into the nursery and set him gently in his bed. My hands were trembling slightly, the delayed surge of adrenaline finally hitting my bloodstream. David's threat echoed in my mind. He was not just issuing empty warnings. The sheer confidence in his cruel tone indicated they possessed a specific strategy for the upcoming will reading. They were planning a public execution. I could not wait for Friday morning to find out what arsenal they were bringing to the battlefield. I needed to understand the exact dimensions of the fortress my grandmother had built, and I needed to verify every single weak point. I grabbed my car keys off the kitchen counter. I dialed the number for Margaret Sterling's office as I walked back out the door. I left Leo with a trusted colleague from my firm. I needed my hands free and my mind razor sharp. The drive back downtown took 20 minutes. I parked in the same concrete structure I had visited with my grandmother just months prior. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt remarkably different this time. I was no longer the designated driver waiting in the lobby. I was the target of a coordinated legal strike, and I needed ammunition. The receptionist at Sterling & Associates recognized me instantly. She ushered me through the heavy oak doors past the silent waiting area and into a corner conference room wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass. Margaret Sterling sat at the head of a long mahogany table. She wore a tailored navy blazer, her silver hair cut into a sharp bob. A thick, leather-bound binder rested directly in front of her. "Take a seat, Peyton," she instructed, her tone brisk and professional. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap. My father and sister ambushed me in my hallway an hour ago. They tried to coerce me into signing a renunciation of my executor rights. They mentioned a new lawyer. Margaret did not look surprised. She opened the heavy binder. A crisp scent of fresh paper and aged leather drifted across the table. "I received a formal notice of contest by fax this morning. Your parents retained a man named Frank Vance. He operates out of a strip mall in the suburbs. His primary tactic is volume. He files aggressive motions, hoping the opposing party settles quickly to avoid public embarrassment. His notice claims you exerted undue influence over a vulnerable woman." I kept my posture rigid. "Can he win?" Margaret offered a thin, razor-sharp smile. "A shark could not bite through the hull of a battleship, Peyton. But we need to review the schematics of the ship your grandmother built." She rotated the binder and slid it across the polished wood. "Read the asset ledger first. I am a wealth manager. I spend 50 hours a week evaluating portfolios, calculating risk, and studying market yields. I am accustomed to looking at large sums of money. But the spreadsheet staring back at me defied my professional expectations. Helen lived in a farmhouse with drafty windows. She wore the same wool sweaters for a decade. She drove a 12-year-old sedan. The ledger painted a vastly different reality. The 400 acres of Nebraska farmland were not merely sustaining the property. Helen had leased the plots to 3 separate commercial agriculture conglomerates. The annual revenue generated from those contracts was staggering. Added to the liquid cash accounts, the municipal bonds, and the appraised value of the historic farmhouse, the bottom line summarized a formidable truth: $4.2 million. I traced the numbers with my index finger, my financial brain automatically running tax implications and compound interest projections. Sylvia was not just fighting for a quaint family homestead or a free yoga studio for Harper. She was launching a war for generational wealth. "Turn to page 4, Margaret instructed quietly. I flipped the heavy parchment. The heading read, "Last Will and Testament of Helen Ramirez." I scanned the introductory paragraphs, skipping the standard legal boilerplate, until my eyes locked on to the distribution clause. "I hereby bequeath my entire estate, including all real property, financial holdings, and personal effects, to my granddaughter, Peyton Ramirez." I read the sentence a second time, then a third. "Where is the division?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What percentage goes to my mother?" Margaret folded her hands on the table. 0. You are the sole heir. You are also the designated sole executor, granting you total authority over the transition of every single asset. I looked up from the binder. Sylvia will tear the state apart. She will drag this through probate court for a decade. She will claim Helen lost her mind. Your grandmother anticipated that exact reaction, Margaret replied, leaning forward. Helen understood the precise nature of her daughter. That is why she kept you in the waiting room during our appointment. She needed the legal record to reflect that you had 0 involvement in drafting this document. Margaret pulled a sleek silver flash drive from her pocket and set it next to the binder. This drive contains 2 hours of high-definition video footage. On the day you drove her here, Helen did not just speak with me. I brought in 2 independent, board-certified neurologists. They conducted a rigorous cognitive capacity examination on camera. Helen answered questions about her finances, her family, and the current calendar year with flawless clarity. Both doctors signed sworn affidavits confirming she possessed total testamentary capacity. A cold chill swept down my arms. Helen had engineered a flawless defense. We went one step further, Margaret continued. Look at Section 7, the Disinheritance Clause. I looked back down at the document. The language shifted from standard legalese into a searing personal declaration. I intentionally and specifically exclude my daughter Sylvia and my granddaughter Harper from any portion of this estate. This exclusion is not an oversight. It is a direct consequence of their established character. Specifically, the documented theft of items intended for my great-grandson Leo. A mother who would return a newborn infant's bed to fund a luxury vacation has forfeited any right to my legacy. My breath caught in my throat. The spreadsheet. The exact numbers I had printed out in the middle of the night. Helen had taken my accounting and cemented it into the foundational bedrock of her will. She had transformed my quiet, passive suffering into a lethal legal weapon. Your father's attorney is relying on a standard playbook, Margaret explained. Frank Vance assumes we will hold the reading right here in this quiet conference room. He expects to walk through those oak doors, pound his fists on this table, and threaten a lengthy public trial. He knows you run a financial planning firm. He knows you rely on an impeccable public reputation. His strategy is to convince you that fighting him will drag your name through the mud. He wants you to cower in a private office and sign a settlement just to make him go away. I stared at the thick parchment. I thought about the text messages circulating through my extended family. Aunt Linda calling me a greedy, desperate single mother. Cousin Greg claiming I was stealing Harper's safe space. The Rotary Club member questioning my professional stability. Sylvia had spent the past 2 weeks constructing a towering lie. She thrived in the shadows of family gossip, counting on my deep-seated fear of conflict to keep the truth buried. She wanted to isolate me, threaten my career, and starve me out. She expected me to shrink under the pressure of an audience. A sudden, crystalline clarity washed over my mind. The anxiety that had gripped my chest since the hospital discharged me evaporated, replaced by a cold, tactical focus. Sylvia built her power using an audience. I was going to use that exact audience to dismantle her. I closed the heavy binder. The loud thud echoed against the glass walls of the conference room. Margaret watched me carefully. "What do you want to do, Peyton?" I picked up the silver flash drive and rolled it between my fingers. The cool metal felt like a loaded chamber. "We are not holding the reading here," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You want a delay?" "No, I want to change the venue." Sylvia signed unauthorized construction contracts out at the farmhouse this morning. She told the commercial growers she is running the estate. She has convinced every aunt, cousin, and family friend that she is the rightful owner, and I am a desperate thief. If we read this document behind closed doors, she will spend the rest of her life spinning a story about how I manipulated the system in secret. I slid the binder back across the mahogany table. "We are moving the reading to the farmhouse," I told her, "and we are not keeping it private. I want you to draft formal invitations. Send them to Aunt Linda, Aunt Susan, Cousin Greg, and the commercial farm tenants. Send one to my father's strip mall lawyer. Invite every single person my mother has lied to over the past 14 days. Margaret studied my face. A slow, razor-sharp smile spread across her lips. "You want to put her on a stage." "She has been rehearsing for weeks," I replied. "It is time to let her perform." I left Margaret Sterling's office with a strategy that felt entirely foreign to my nature. For 3 decades, my default response to family conflict was retreat. If Sylvia raised her voice, I lowered mine. If Harper demanded the spotlight, I faded into the background. My professional life was built on managing risk, but my personal life was defined by avoiding it altogether. That dynamic ended the moment I turned the key in my ignition. I did not wait for Margaret's paralegals to draft the formal invitations. A tactical ambush requires a personal touch. I connected my phone to the car's Bluetooth system and began dialing numbers before I even exited the parking garage. I called Aunt Linda first. She answered on the 4th ring, her greeting thick with manufactured caution. "Peyton, I am surprised to hear from you." I modulated my voice, smoothing out the hard edges and adopting a tone of exhausted warmth. "Hi, Aunt Linda. I know things have been tense lately. The grief has been hard on all of us." A heavy, validating sigh crackled through the speakers. "Well, you know, your mother is just devastated. She just wants this family to heal." "I understand," I replied softly. "That is why I wanted to reach out. The lawyer is ready to read Grandma's will on Friday morning. I asked her to move the proceeding to the farmhouse. I think Helen would want us all together in her home, honoring her final wishes as a family. I would love it if you and Uncle Robert could be there." The shift in Linda's demeanor was instantaneous. The defensive frost melted into eager approval. "Oh, Peyton, that is a wonderful idea. Your mother will be so relieved. We will absolutely be there." I ended the call and dialed Cousin Greg next. I delivered the same carefully crafted script. I called Thomas, the commercial corn grower, and asked him to bring the other 2 tenant farmers, stressing that the family wanted full transparency regarding the future of the leases. I extended the olive branch to every single relative who had participated in the smear campaign. I knew exactly how Sylvia would interpret these calls. She lacked the capacity for complex psychological analysis. She viewed the world strictly in terms of dominance and submission. By inviting the extended family to the farmhouse, I was signaling total capitulation. Sylvia would assume the pressure of the group chat, and the threat to my financial planning career had successfully broken my resolve. In her mind, I was too terrified of further public humiliation to fight her in front of an audience. She believed I had arranged a grand public stage to formally hand over the estate and beg for her forgiveness. The confirmation arrived 20 minutes later. My phone chimed with a notification from the family group chat. Sylvia had posted an update. "Peyton just called Linda. We are doing the reading at the farmhouse on Friday. I am so glad she is finally doing the right thing and putting family first. See you all there." Harper followed up immediately with a string of prayer hands and heart emojis. I turned off the interstate, a cold, quiet satisfaction settling in my chest. The trap was set. Sylvia was marching her entire army straight into a fortress they believed was built of glass. They had no idea they were walking into a reinforced concrete bunker designed by Helen and armed by Margaret Sterling. The following 48 hours crawled by in a tense, suspended animation. I continued my daily routine. I managed my client portfolios. I fed Leo. I slept in brief, exhausted intervals. But my mind remained locked on the upcoming collision. Friday morning broke crisp and clear, a classic Nebraska autumn day. I did not dress like a grieving granddaughter. I dressed like an executive walking into a hostile boardroom. I chose a tailored charcoal suit, sharp and unyielding, paired with low, sensible heels. I pulled my hair back into a tight twist. I packed Leo's diaper bag with meticulous precision. The farmhouse sat 30 miles outside the Omaha city limits. The property was accessed via a long, winding gravel driveway lined with towering cottonwood trees. I pulled through the iron gates at 9:55. The reading was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp. The scene unfolding on the sweeping front lawn confirmed every tactical assumption I had made. Sylvia had not treated this event like a solemn legal proceeding. She had staged a coronation. The gravel driveway was packed with vehicles. Aunt Linda's SUV, Cousin Greg's sedan, and the heavy-duty pickup trucks belonging to the commercial farm tenants were all parked in neat rows. Sitting front and center, dominating the space near the wide wraparound porch, was Sylvia's luxury crossover. I parked my car near the edge of the lawn, unbuckled Leo from his car seat, and settled him securely into his fabric chest carrier. I grabbed my black leather work tote. Inside lay a single plain manila folder. I walked up the wooden porch steps. The heavy oak front door was propped wide open, inviting the crisp autumn breeze into the house. The low murmur of 30 voices drifted out from the massive main living room. I stepped over the threshold. Sylvia stood near the stone fireplace holding court. She wore a pristine cream-colored blouse and dark slacks, radiating the confident glow of a victorious general. Harper was stationed beside her, casually scrolling through her phone. Resting on the antique oak coffee table in the center of the room was a large silver ice bucket. 2 green glass bottles of expensive champagne protruded from the melting ice. Next to the bucket sat a stack of clear plastic cups. Sylvia had literally brought champagne to a will reading. She spotted me lingering in the entryway. The room fell silent as her gaze locked onto mine. The relatives turned their faces a mixture of curiosity and manufactured pity. Aunt Linda offered a tight, encouraging smile, silently applauding my supposed surrender. Sylvia did not walk over to greet me. She stood her ground, forcing me to cross the large room and approach her position of power. "You look very professional, Peyton," Sylvia noted, her tone dripping with condescension. "I am glad you decided to handle this the right way. We can get through the paperwork quickly and start talking about the renovations." I did not offer a polite smile. I did not apologize for my attire. I stepped into the center of the room, my posture perfectly straight. The weight of Leo resting against my chest grounded me. "We will begin when the attorney is ready, Mom," I said smoothly. A sharp knock echoed from the open front entryway. The crowd shifted their attention. Margaret Sterling stood in the doorway. She wore a sharp black suit and carried her heavy leather binder. Trailing behind her was a man I did not recognize. He wore a rumpled gray suit that fit poorly across the shoulders, and he carried a battered canvas briefcase. He looked slightly out of breath, his eyes darting nervously around the crowded room. Sylvia's smile widened into a triumphant grin. She gestured toward the rumpled man. "Peyton, meet Frank Vance. He is the attorney Dad and I hired. He is here to make sure everything is handled properly today." Frank offered a brief, aggressive nod, stepping into the room like a boxer entering a ring. He took in the crowd, the champagne, and the solemn face of Margaret Sterling. He puffed out his chest, clearly preparing to deliver the opening monologue of a performance he believed he was directing. Margaret did not look at Frank. She walked directly to the large dining table at the back of the room, set her heavy binder down, and unclasped the leather strap. The click of the metal fastener echoed like a gunshot in the sudden silence. The trap was fully populated. The doors were locked. The performance was about to begin. The farmhouse living room held 30 people, yet the sprawling space felt suffocating. Air conditioning vents hummed overhead, fighting a losing battle against the collective body heat of aunts, cousins, and agricultural tenants. Sylvia had arranged 24 folding chairs in a wide semicircle, mimicking the layout of a small theater. She positioned herself at the very front, reserving a prominent seat for my father and my sister. I stood near the back wall, keeping a physical distance from the folding chairs. Leo remained asleep in his carrier against my chest. His soft, steady breathing served as a grounding metronome amidst the escalating tension. A loud pop fractured the low murmur of the crowd. Sylvia had stripped the foil from a green bottle and forced the cork out. Foam bubbled over the glass lip, dripping onto the antique hardwood floor. She grabbed the stack of clear plastic cups and began pouring. She moved through the front row, distributing the alcohol like party favors at a weekend brunch. "Just a small toast," Sylvia told Aunt Susan, handing her a brimming cup, "to new beginnings and family healing." She offered a drink to Thomas, the corn grower. He accepted it, awkwardly holding the fragile plastic by the rim, clearly unsure why he was holding a celebratory beverage at a probate reading. I watched my mother work the room. She was celebrating a victory she had not yet secured, fueled by a dangerous, blinding arrogance. She assumed the legal system was merely a formality, a minor bureaucratic hurdle she could bulldoze through sheer social willpower. She believed that controlling the room meant controlling the outcome. Margaret Sterling stood at the far end of the room, positioned behind a heavy oak dining table. She did not ask for a drink. She did not mingle. She simply placed her thick leather binder onto the polished wood and tapped a silver pen against the cover. "If we could find our seats," Margaret announced. Her voice lacked shouting volume, yet it carried a razor-sharp authority that instantly commanded obedience. The low chatter evaporated. The relatives shuffled toward the folding chairs. Plastic cups clinked as people settled into their places. Margaret reached for the brass clasp of her binder. Before she could flip the cover open, Frank Vance stepped directly into the center of the semicircle. He unbuttoned his rumpled gray suit jacket, hooking a thumb into his belt loop. He offered a folksy, practiced smile to the gathered audience, deliberately turning his back on Margaret Sterling. Frank was a man who traded on volume rather than precision. He possessed the polished, superficial charm of a local politician, his hair heavily gelled, his cologne carrying a sharp, artificial scent that overpowered the faint smell of old wood and dust in the farmhouse. Folks, Frank began projecting his voice to ensure it reached the farthest corners of the room. Before we get bogged down in the dry legal jargon, I want to say a few words on behalf of David and Sylvia Ramirez. He paced a few steps to the left, establishing eye contact with Aunt Linda, then swept his gaze over to the commercial farmers. "We all know why we are gathered here today," Frank continued. "Helen was a titan in this community. She built an impressive legacy. But the last few months of her life brought a heavy burden. Time takes its toll on all of us. The mind clouds. Confusion sets in." He lowered his tone, adopting a conspiratorial, sorrowful cadence. He was playing a jury that possessed zero legal standing, manipulating the emotions of the crowd to construct a narrative out of thin air. "Unfortunately," Frank said, shaking his head. "When a matriarch loses her clarity, she becomes vulnerable, especially to those closest to her. We have a tragic situation on our hands. We have a young mother facing the terrifying financial realities of raising a child alone who might make desperate choices. A daughter who might guide a confused, vulnerable woman's hand to sign documents she did not fully understand." A collective murmur rippled through the folding chairs. Aunt Susan sighed heavily, leaning over to whisper something to Cousin Greg. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking down at his boots. Frank had deployed his primary weapon. He painted a picture of elder abuse, casting me as the desperate villain and my parents as the noble protectors of Helen's true wishes. He provided the extended family with a convenient, dramatic storyline that justified my mother's aggressive behavior over the past 2 weeks. Sylvia leaned into the performance flawlessly. She reached into her pocket and produced a folded white tissue. She pressed it carefully to the dry corners of her eyes, ensuring she did not smudge her mascara. She let her shoulders tremble just enough to project heartbreak, looking down at the floor as if the betrayal was too heavy to bear. Harper sat beside her, practically vibrating with anticipation. She held her plastic cup of champagne with both hands, her eyes darting toward the antique sunroom. I could see the exact gears turning in her head. She was already mentally measuring the square footage for her yoga mats, convinced that Frank's speech was the final hurdle before she inherited her sanctuary. Frank turned his attention toward me, pointing a finger in my direction. "We are filing a formal contest on the grounds of undue influence," he declared, his voice ringing with manufactured righteous indignation. "David and Sylvia will not allow this estate to be hijacked. We will ensure Helen's true intentions are honored, no matter how long it takes." He finished his monologue standing tall in the center of the room, waiting for my reaction. He expected me to crack. He expected the weight of 30 judging stares to crush my composure. He wanted me to interrupt him, to shout my defense, to scramble forward and plead my case to the aunts and cousins. If I reacted with anger, I proved his hypothesis. I became the unstable, desperate woman he had just described. A younger version of myself would have fallen for the bait. I would have felt the familiar, suffocating pressure to explain myself, to fix the misunderstanding, to make the bad energy dissipate. I did not move a single muscle. I maintained my position against the back wall. I kept my face entirely blank, a smooth mask of professional indifference. I watched Frank Vance the same way I watch a junior analyst present a flawed financial projection. I let the silence stretch out, allowing his words to hang in the air, unsupported by a single shred of factual evidence. I knew the structural integrity of his argument. It was a house of cards, built on a foundation of family gossip. I was going to let him stack it as high as possible. The taller the structure, the harder the collapse. Frank lowered his arm, his confident smile faltering for a fraction of a second, when he realized I was not going to provide the emotional outburst he required to sustain his momentum. He cleared his throat, buttoned his suit jacket, and took a step back, taking his seat next to David. The room remained hushed. The audience waited for the ensuing battle. Margaret Sterling had not interrupted Frank's speech. She had not objected to his blatant character assassination. She had simply watched him pace, her expression conveying a deep, terminal boredom. She reached up and adjusted the frame of her glasses. She looked out over the crowd of relatives, her gaze lingering on the plastic cups of champagne scattered across the laps of the attendees. Then, entirely unfazed by the theatrics, she opened the official, notarized binder. Margaret Sterling did not clear her throat. She did not tap a glass for attention. When you wield absolute authority, you do not request quiet. You simply wait for the room to realize you are speaking. The heavy parchment pages of the binder turned with a thick, deliberate sound. "We are gathered to execute the last will and testament of Helen Ramirez," Margaret began. Her voice cut through the stale air of the farmhouse like a scalpel. It lacked the theatrical cadence Frank Vance had just employed. It was clinical, devoid of sentiment, and terrifyingly precise. She read the preliminary boilerplate language confirming the dates of notarization and the presence of 2 independent witnesses. The dry legal terminology immediately began to leach the manufactured emotion out of the room. Sylvia's quiet, performative sniffling sounded absurd against the backdrop of standard probate procedure. Margaret paused. She looked up from the document, her gaze bypassing the audience and locking directly onto Frank Vance. "Before we proceed to the distributions," Margaret said, her tone dropping a degree in temperature, "I need to address the notice of contest filed by opposing counsel this morning." Frank straightened his posture, leaning forward in his folding chair. He assumed he was about to engage in a spirited legal debate. He believed Margaret was going to defend my character, which would allow him to launch further accusations regarding my financial motives. He misunderstood the nature of the battlefield. Margaret was not going to defend me. She was going to obliterate his foundational premise. Margaret reached into the pocket of her tailored navy blazer. She withdrew a sleek silver flash drive. She held it up for a fraction of a second, ensuring the metallic surface caught the overhead light, before sliding it smoothly across the polished oak dining table. The drive stopped inches from the edge, directly in front of the empty chair closest to Frank. Counselor Margaret stated, keeping her eyes locked on his face. Your notice claims the testator suffered from cognitive decline and was highly susceptible to manipulation. It asserts she lacked the mental fortitude to understand the legal documents she executed. Frank offered a tight, confident nod. We believe the medical records will show a rapid deterioration. That drive contains 2 hours of high-definition video footage. Margaret interrupted, her voice snapping like a whip. It was recorded 48 hours prior to the execution of this will. Frank's mouth closed. The confident nod froze. The footage documents 2 separate, exhaustive psychiatric capacity examinations. Margaret continued, her words landing like physical blows. The evaluations were conducted by independent, board-certified neurologists. They asked Helen detailed questions regarding her assets, her lineage, and the specific reasons behind her legal choices. The drive also contains sworn, notarized affidavits from both medical professionals, confirming, without a shadow of a doubt, that Helen Ramirez possessed flawless testamentary capacity. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the hushed anticipation of an audience waiting for drama. It was the breathless, suffocating quiet of 30 people watching a fatal collision occur in slow motion. Margaret folded her hands on top of her binder. Therefore, your claim of undue influence is not merely speculative, it is factually baseless. If you proceed with this contest, my firm will move for immediate dismissal with prejudice, and we will petition the court to hold you personally liable for all associated legal fees due to a frivolous filing. Frank Vance stared at the silver flash drive resting on the table. He did not reach for it. He was a strip mall lawyer who traded in intimidation tactics and quick settlements. He relied on clients providing him with accurate information so he could construct his bluffs. He turned his head slowly, his gaze shifting from the flash drive to David and Sylvia sitting in the front row. The look on his face was a mixture of dawning realization and professional fury. He realized in front of a packed room that his clients had lied to him. Sylvia and David had hired him based on a fabricated narrative of a confused, failing old woman. They had concealed the reality of Helen's sharp intellect, probably because they had convinced themselves of their own lie. They had sent him into a legal gunfight armed with a water pistol. Frank did not utter a single word of rebuttal. He did not object. He simply broke eye contact with my parents, sank back down into his folding chair, and crossed his arms over his chest. He was suddenly very, very quiet. His silence communicated everything the audience needed to know. The grand defense had collapsed before a single piece of property had been distributed. Sylvia's hand tightened around her plastic cup. The knuckles turned stark white. Her eyes darted frantically toward Frank, waiting for him to object, to argue, to do the job she was paying him to do. Frank stared straight ahead, entirely unresponsive. Margaret adjusted her glasses and turned back to the heavy binder. She did not offer a moment for the room to recover. She proceeded directly to the core of the document. Article 4, Asset Distribution. Margaret read, her voice ringing clear and undisputed. Aunt Linda leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. Thomas adjusted his cap. Harper stopped breathing, her gaze fixed on the attorney. I hereby revoke all prior wills and codicils, Margaret recited. To my granddaughter, Peyton Ramirez, I leave my entire estate. Margaret paused for a half-second, ensuring the next words landed with maximum impact. This includes all real property, the 400 acres of commercial agricultural land, all liquid financial holdings, investment accounts, and personal effects. Peyton Ramirez is named sole heir and sole executor, granting her total and immediate authority over the transition of all assets. The pronouncement hit the room with the force of a physical shockwave. No percentages, no trusts, no shared ownership, Aunt Susan gasped a sharp intake of air that echoed loudly. Cousin Greg dropped his phone. It clattered against the hardwood floor. Thomas turned his head slowly, his eyes wide, as he looked directly at me, standing against the back wall. The audience, who had spent the last 2 weeks consuming Sylvia's narrative of a desperate, greedy, single mother attempting to steal a fraction of an inheritance, suddenly understood the math. I had not stolen anything. I had been handed the entire empire. Margaret was not finished. She turned to page 4, Article 7, Disinheritance Clause. The room seemed to shrink. I intentionally and specifically exclude my daughter Sylvia and my granddaughter Harper from any portion of this estate, Margaret read. This exclusion is not an oversight. It is a direct consequence of their established character. Specifically, the documented theft of items intended for my great-grandson Leo. A mother who would return a newborn infant's bed to fund a luxury vacation has forfeited any right to my legacy. The legal terminology stripped away every layer of Sylvia's protective coloring. The audience did not hear a story about a healing wellness retreat or an aura reset. They heard the cold, brutal truth recorded in a legally binding document. They heard that the matriarch of the family had watched her daughter rob a nursery and had retaliated by erasing her from the bloodline. For 3 agonizing seconds, the farmhouse living room was dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the explosion happened. Sylvia sprang out of her folding chair. The sudden, violent upward motion caused the metal legs to scrape harshly against the antique floorboards. Her arm jerked, and the plastic cup in her hand crushed inward. A wave of pale, expensive champagne sloshed over the rim, splattering across her pristine cream blouse and raining down onto the polished oak coffee table. The stain of spilled champagne spread across the antique oak coffee table, soaking into the delicate lace runner my grandmother had kept there for decades. The liquid dripped off the carved wooden edge, hitting the floorboards with a steady, rhythmic tapping. That soft sound was entirely eclipsed by the sound of my mother unspooling. "This is a forgery," Sylvia screamed. The polished veneer of the heartbroken, grieving daughter shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Her performative sorrow vanished, replaced instantly by a feral, unhinged rage. The veins in her neck strained against her pale skin, her jaw locked into a tight, desperate snarl. She pointed a shaking finger at the heavy leather binder resting on the dining table. She was sick, Sylvia shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceiling of the farmhouse. She did not know what she was signing. "You manipulated her. You brought in paid actors to film a fake medical exam. I am her daughter. I am the rightful heir." Margaret Sterling did not flinch. She did not raise her voice to argue. She simply closed the thick binder, fastened the brass clasp, and folded her hands on top of the leather cover. She observed my mother with the detached fascination of a scientist studying a volatile chemical reaction. Denied a response from the attorney, Sylvia pivoted. She turned her frantic energy toward the audience, desperate to reclaim the social power that was rapidly evaporating from the room. She needed her chorus. She needed the extended family to validate her outrage and condemn the legal reality they had just witnessed. She lunged toward the front row of folding chairs. "Linda, tell them this is a lie," Sylvia demanded, gesturing wildly. "You know Helen wanted Harper to have this house. You know she intended to leave the estate to me. Tell them." Aunt Linda physically recoiled. The woman who had sent me a text message calling me a greedy, desperate single mother just days prior now looked as though she had swallowed poison. Linda shrank back into her plastic chair, pulling her purse tightly onto her lap. She averted her eyes, staring resolutely at the baseboards. She realized the narrative she had championed was a fabricated illusion, and she wanted no part of the fallout. Sylvia spun toward the commercial tenants sitting in the second row. "Thomas, you know me. You know I am running this operation. Tell this lawyer we already have renovation plans." Thomas slowly removed his faded work cap. He held it in both hands, refusing to meet Sylvia's frantic gaze. He looked past her, fixing his eyes directly on me. He offered a slow, respectful nod. He was a businessman. He recognized that the woman screaming in the center of the room held zero authority, and the silent woman, standing against the back wall, was his new landlord. The audience was frozen. Nobody whispered. Nobody offered a comforting hand. The crowd my mother had spent 2 weeks cultivating into a weapon had officially laid down their arms. Realizing her audience had abandoned her, a new sound pierced the heavy tension in the living room. It was a wet, ragged sobbing. Harper had remained frozen in her seat during the reading of the disinheritance clause. The reality of the legal document was finally penetrating her calculated exterior. The tears streaming down her face were no longer the orchestrated, delicate drops she utilized for her social media followers. This was genuine, ugly panic. She was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved beneath her expensive designer dress. She clutched her smartphone with white-knuckled intensity. She was not mourning the loss of a grandmother. She was mourning the sudden, catastrophic destruction of her curated lifestyle. The plans for the private yoga studio were vaporized. The luxury vacations funded by stolen nursery gifts were permanently canceled. The financial safety net she had enjoyed her entire adult life had just been cut, sending her free-falling into a reality where she would actually have to support herself. She wept with the profound, suffocating terror of a spoiled child realizing the adults had left the room. Beside her, David remained motionless. My father stared down at his scuffed brown shoes. The tired peacemaker possessed no script for this disaster. He could not slide a renunciation document across a hallway console table to make this conflict disappear. He had followed his wife into a legal minefield, armed with nothing but unearned entitlement, and he had just watched a seasoned attorney detonate the ground beneath their feet. He surrendered to the silence, refusing to look up, refusing to intervene. Sylvia realized she was entirely alone. Her lawyer was mute, her husband was defeated, her audience was disgusted. She whipped her head around and locked her eyes on me. She marched across the antique rug, closing the distance between us. She stopped 3 feet away, her chest rising and falling with rapid, erratic breaths. She smelled of sour champagne and expensive perfume. "You little thief," Sylvia hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "You greedy, ungrateful little thief. You think you have won. You think you can walk in here with your fancy suit and steal my family legacy." I did not step back. I kept Leo secured against my chest, his warm weight anchoring me to the floorboards. "I gave you life," Sylvia screamed, the volume tearing through her vocal cords. "I raised you. I fed you. I clothed you. You owe us. We are your family. You are nothing without this family. You manipulated a dying woman to steal a farm you do not even know how to run." She was deploying the ultimate weapon of the toxic parent, the unpayable debt of existence. She believed that providing basic biological necessities granted her a lifetime lease on my dignity, my boundaries, and my assets. She expected the sheer force of her maternal rage to break my posture, to force me into the familiar, submissive crouch I had occupied for 30 years. I looked down at the plastic cup still clenched in her right hand. The cheap material was crushed inward from the force of her grip. A single drop of pale champagne clung to the jagged plastic rim. I watched the drop tremble. I watched it slide slowly down the clear plastic, navigating the ridges and cracks, until it reached the bottom and fell onto the tip of her leather shoe. The contrast between us crystallized in the quiet farmhouse. Sylvia was a hurricane of frantic, desperate greed. She was loud, messy, and entirely out of control, flailing against a reality she could no longer manipulate. I was a vault. I possessed a profound, terrifying stillness. I did not need to scream to claim my space in the room. I did not need an audience to validate my existence. The deed to the 400 acres, the historic house we were standing in, the millions sitting in the investment accounts, they were all legally, irrevocably mine. Her noise could not alter the ink on the parchment. The energy in the room shifted permanently. The relatives watching the confrontation stopped looking at Sylvia with pity. They looked at her with exhausted contempt. They recognized the hysteria of a woman who had been caught in a colossal lie. I lifted my gaze from the crushed plastic cup and looked directly into my mother's eyes. I did not offer an apology. I did not attempt to explain my innocence. I did not return her screaming vitriol. I simply stepped around her. I walked toward the large dining table where Margaret Sterling stood waiting. The crowd parted instinctively, clearing a path across the antique rug. I set my black leather work tote onto the polished wood. I unzipped the main compartment. Sylvia turned around, watching me with a mixture of confusion and lingering rage. It was time to fire the weapon Helen had loaded for me months ago. I reached inside the tote bag and placed my hand flat on top of the plain manila folder. I kept my hand resting flat on the smooth surface of the manila folder. I did not open it immediately. I let the silence in the farmhouse stretch, allowing the echoes of Sylvia's frantic screaming to fade into the high wooden rafters. The contrast between us was stark, final, and irrefutable. Sylvia was panting, her face flushed with exertion, her posture crumbling under the weight of her own failed theatrics. I was calm. My heart rate held steady. I felt the soft, rhythmic rise and fall of my son breathing against my chest. When you spend a decade auditing financial discrepancies, you learn that anger is an inefficient tool. Data is the only weapon that matters. A screaming person can be dismissed as emotional or unstable. A person holding a ledger is terrifying. I looked at my mother. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the measured, lethal calm of an investigator delivering a final verdict. "You did not raise me, Mom." I kept my tone soft, forcing the room to lean forward to catch the words. "You managed me. You treated my life like a corporate subsidiary. You drew from my accounts to cover Harper's deficits. You balanced your emotional checkbook by ensuring I always carried the debt. For 30 years, I allowed it. I accepted the terms of that arrangement to keep the peace." Sylvia opened her mouth to interrupt, to launch another volley of practiced guilt, but I held up a single index finger. The simple, authoritative gesture stopped her cold. "But when Leo was born, you altered the arrangement." I continued my gaze, locking onto hers. "You did not just ignore your grandson. You stole from him." A collective murmur rippled through the folding chairs. Cousin Greg frowned, leaning forward. Aunt Susan exchanged a bewildered glance with the commercial corn grower sitting next to her. The narrative they had been fed over the past 2 weeks featured me as the desperate thief. They possessed zero context for the accusation I had just leveled. It was time to provide the context. I opened the manila folder. The crisp sound of paper sliding against paper cut through the quiet room. I pulled out a thick stack of printed spreadsheets. They were not the informal documents I had generated on my laptop in the middle of the night. These pages bore the official watermark of the retail corporation where I had registered for my baby shower. I separated the stack into 3 distinct bundles. I slid the first bundle across the polished oak table toward Aunt Linda. I handed the second bundle to Thomas. I pushed the third bundle toward Cousin Greg. The relatives hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching out to take the documents. The rustle of turning pages filled the living room. "These are the official store return logs," I explained, pacing my words to match their reading speed. Ms. Sterling subpoenaed them directly from the corporate retailer to attach as formal exhibits to the estate file. They are legally verified transaction records. I turned my attention to Aunt Linda. She was staring at the top sheet, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. "Look at column A, Linda," I instructed. "It lists the item descriptions. Look at column B. It lists the original purchaser. Now trace your finger across to column D. That is the exact dollar amount refunded to the person standing at the customer service desk." Linda's eyes darted across the page. Her face lost its color, draining into a sickly shade of gray. "You purchased the organic cotton swaddle set for Leo," I said, keeping my voice devoid of emotion. "Row 14. My mother returned them for $42 in store credit." Linda gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She looked up at Sylvia, her expression morphing from confusion into a profound, visceral disgust. I did not stop there. I walked the room through the math. I became the financial planner, breaking down a fraudulent account. Row 3, the oak bassinet, $399. Row 8, the infant bathtub. Row 12, the diaper pail. She returned the bottles. She returned the fitted sheets. Look at row 27, $14.99 for a set of silicone teething rings. The audience physically recoiled. Reading the itemized list stripped away any illusion of a simple misunderstanding. The forensic breakdown exposed the petty, methodical nature of the betrayal. Sylvia had not merely made a poor judgment call in a moment of panic. She had stood at a retail counter for over an hour, handing over pacifiers and swaddles to extract every single available cent from her newborn grandson. I looked at the bottom of the final page. I told the crowd, the total sum extracted from the nursery is $1,247.63. I shifted my gaze from the audience to my sister. Harper had stopped sobbing. She was staring at the floorboards, her shoulders curled inward, trying to shrink herself down to an invisible point. That is the exact cost of a wellness retreat, I noted, letting the silence wrap around the words. Harper posted photos holding a pale pink cocktail by an infinity pool. She captioned the image, "Blessed with the best parents." She told her social media followers she was healing her trauma. She was drinking margaritas funded by returned pacifiers and stolen diapers. The social dynamic in the farmhouse crumbled. The weapon Sylvia had spent 2 weeks loading turned and fired directly into her own ranks. Aunt Linda dropped the spreadsheet onto her lap. She looked sick to her stomach. She remembered sending me a text message calling me a greedy, desperate single mother. She realized Sylvia had manipulated her into attacking the victim of a robbery. Linda turned toward my mother. "How could you do that, Sylvia? He is a baby." Sylvia's chest heaved. The polished matriarch was gone, leaving behind a cornered, exposed fraud. She looked at Linda, then at Greg, searching for a lifeline. She stammered, her voice shaking. It was just store credit. Peyton was fine. She had plenty of things for the baby. Harper was in a crisis. Families share their resources. Families share, I corrected her, my tone dropping to a cold whisper. Predators extract. David closed his eyes, rubbing his temples with his trembling hands. The tired peacemaker could not mediate a ledger. His strip mall attorney, Frank Vance, remained seated, staring blankly at the wall, wanting nothing to do with the toxic fallout cascading around him. The crowd had turned. The commercial tenants glared at my parents with open hostility. The aunts whispered to each other in harsh, condemning tones. Sylvia had brought an audience to watch my execution, and instead, they were serving as the jury for her own conviction. The financial ledger proved the theft. It destroyed Sylvia's credibility and dismantled her smear campaign in a matter of minutes. But the spreadsheet was only the first part of the defense Helen had constructed. Helen did not just want to prove my innocence. She wanted to ensure the family understood the exact reason behind her final verdict. She wanted her voice to echo in this room one last time. I turned back to my black leather work tote resting on the dining table. I reached past the empty space where the manila folder had been. My fingers brushed against the thick, textured paper resting at the very bottom of the bag. I pulled out the heavy envelope. The flap was still sealed shut with thick, clear tape. The exterior bore my name written in the sharp, sloping, cursive handwriting my grandmother had used to sign agriculture leases for 4 decades. I held the envelope up so the entire room could see the unbroken seal. I held the heavy envelope by the corner, ensuring the fluorescent light caught the thick strip of clear packing tape binding the flap. The cursive handwriting scrawled across the front served as a silent testament to a woman who refused to leave her legacy unguarded. My grandmother handed me this envelope on the day she visited Margaret Sterling's office, I announced, addressing the quiet room. She gave me specific instructions. She told me to keep it sealed until she was gone. I have honored that request. I do not know what is written on the pages inside, but I know Helen. She did not waste ink on sentiment. I slid my thumb under the edge of the packing tape. The sharp tearing sound ripped through the suffocating tension in the farmhouse living room. I extracted 3 sheets of heavy parchment. The ink was dark, the strokes deliberate and firm. Helen had not dictated this message to a paralegal. She had drafted her final verdict by hand, cementing her authority into every sloping letter. I cleared my throat, anchored my stance, and began to read. To my family and to the legal representatives executing my estate. The opening line carried the weight of a judge calling a courtroom to order. I am writing this document while in full possession of my faculties. I have completed the necessary medical examinations. I have secured the legal boundaries of my assets. I am taking this additional step to ensure my intentions cannot be twisted, distorted, or subjected to convenient misinterpretation by those who excel at manufacturing their own reality. Aunt Susan adjusted her posture, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Cousin Greg stared intently at the parchment in my hands. They recognized the tone. This was the voice of the matriarch, who had managed 400 acres of commercial agriculture without yielding an inch to aggressive competitors. For 30 years, Helen's letter continued. I have watched a slow, quiet injustice unfold within my own bloodline. I have observed my daughter Sylvia systematically extract the vitality from her eldest child to subsidize the perpetual adolescence of her youngest. Sylvia let out a sharp, choked gasp. She clamped a hand over her mouth, but the sound escaped, a visceral reaction to being stripped bare in front of her assembled audience. I remained focused on the page. I did not pause to allow her to recover. I watched Peyton sacrifice her quiet, her savings, and her dignity to maintain a peace that Sylvia constantly threatened to destroy, Helen wrote. I remained silent because I believed a family must navigate its own internal terrain. I assumed the dynamic would eventually self-correct. I was wrong. I turned to the second page. The handwriting grew slightly tighter, reflecting the rising anger of the woman who penned it. The limit of my tolerance was breached 3 days after my great-grandson was born. I sat on my daughter's sofa and listened as she justified returning a newborn infant's bassinet to fund a luxury beach vacation for a grown woman. I watched a grandmother steal a bed from a child to purchase a margarita. Harper flinched, shrinking further down into her folding chair. She stared blankly at her knees, her face burning with a deep, consuming humiliation. The curated Instagram aesthetic she had spent years building was publicly dismantled, exposed as a parasitic facade funded by her sister's suffering. In that moment, Helen declared, her words slicing through the quiet room. I realized my daughter was entirely bankrupt of character. I realized that if I left this estate to Sylvia, the 400 acres my husband and I cleared by hand would be liquidated within a decade to cover Harper's debts and Sylvia's vanity. The legacy would be squandered, and Peyton would be left managing the catastrophic fallout. A profound, heavy silence blanketed the audience. The aunts, who had spent the previous 2 weeks sending nasty text messages condemning my greed, finally understood the magnitude of their error. They had blindly supported a woman whose own mother had recognized her as a parasite. I looked at the final paragraph on the third page. Peyton is the only member of this family who understands the value of $1, the weight of responsibility, and the true meaning of loyalty. She did not ask for this inheritance. She did not manipulate me to secure it. I am giving it to her because she is the only one strong enough to hold it. I leave this earth knowing my legacy is secured behind a fortress, and I leave strict instructions to Margaret Sterling to defend that fortress against any contest my daughter attempts to mount. I lowered the parchment. The reading was complete. The defense was total. Sylvia did not scream this time. The explosive rage that had characterized her earlier outburst had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell. Her knees buckled. She collapsed backward into the folding chair, her breath coming in short, erratic gasps. She looked to her left. Aunt Linda averted her eyes. She looked to her right. The commercial tenants stared straight ahead, refusing to meet her gaze. For the first time in 30 years, Sylvia Ramirez fell apart in a crowded room, and absolutely nobody rushed to comfort her. Her audience was gone. The silence was broken by the sharp snap of metal clasps closing. Frank Vance, the aggressive strip mall attorney my parents had hired to bully me into submission, stood up from his chair. He did not address the crowd. He did not offer a closing argument. He picked up his battered canvas briefcase and turned to face David. My father looked up, his expression desperate, searching for a legal loophole that did not exist. "Frank, what are our options here? We can file an appeal, right?" Frank shook his head, his face a mask of professional disgust. He realized he had been dragged into a dispute armed with fabricated evidence, positioned against a legendary estate attorney, and humiliated in front of 30 witnesses. "I am withdrawing as your counsel," Frank stated, his voice flat and definitive. David blinked, stunned. "You cannot just leave. We paid you a retainer." "I will mail you a certified check for the unused balance tomorrow morning," Frank replied, snapping his briefcase shut. "You lied to me about the medical exams. You lied to me about the nature of the disinheritance. If I pursue this contest, Sterling will file sanctions against my license for bringing a frivolous suit, and the judge will grant them. You have zero standing, David. The estate is gone." Frank did not wait for a response. He turned his back on my parents, offered a brief, respectful nod to Margaret Sterling, and walked briskly out the front door of the farmhouse. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, sealing the finality of the defeat. The legal battle was over before it ever reached a courtroom. The audience had served as the jury, and the verdict was unanimous. David buried his face in his hands. Harper continued to stare at the floorboards, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public embarrassment. Sylvia remained slumped in her chair. The performative matriarch was completely broken. Her power stripped, her reputation in ashes. The realization of her total defeat settled over her like a suffocating blanket. But a predator rarely surrenders without attempting to salvage a single piece of leverage. Sylvia possessed one final desperate card to play, a chaotic variable she had set into motion before the will reading had commenced. She lifted her head, her eyes locking onto me. The venom had drained from her gaze, replaced by a frantic, scrambling panic. "Peyton?" Sylvia gasped, her voice trembling. "You cannot just throw us out. I signed contracts." I maintained my position at the front of the room, my hands resting lightly on my black tote bag. "What contracts?" Sylvia swallowed hard. "The renovations. I hired the demolition crew. I signed the paperwork with the general contractor yesterday afternoon to start tearing down the sunroom on Monday. They ordered custom materials." She was grasping at straws, hoping the financial liability would force me into a negotiation. She expected me to panic at the prospect of managing an active construction dispute. I let a cold, tactical smile touch the corners of my mouth. The final payoff was aligning perfectly. I looked at my mother, watching the desperate calculus working behind her eyes. She genuinely believed the threat of a pending construction invoice would force me to the negotiating table. In her mind, the prospect of dealing with angry contractors and custom material orders was a crisis only she could manage. She expected me to fold to offer a concession, to beg her to handle the mess she had created. I took a slow, steady breath. The air in the farmhouse felt pristine, cleared of the toxic fog that had suffocated my family for 3 decades. "Let us review basic contract law." "Mom," I said, my voice carrying the crisp, neutral cadence of a financial audit. "Margaret Sterling is the attorney of record for this estate. I am the sole executor. Did you obtain a signature from either of us before you engaged that demolition crew?" Sylvia blinked, her pale face tightening. "No. I told them I was the owner. I signed the work orders yesterday." I offered a small, terrifyingly polite smile. "You lied to a vendor. You signed binding financial agreements using your own name, claiming authority over a property you do not possess. The estate holds zero liability for those contracts." The blood drained from Sylvia's face, leaving her skin a translucent, sickly gray. "You ordered custom materials for a private yoga studio." I continued outlining the stark reality of her situation. "You authorized demolition. The cancellation fees alone will be astronomical. You are personally on the hook for those invoices. Every single dollar." I watched the realization hit her. The trap she had so carefully laid for me had sprung backward, catching her firmly by the ankle. She had tried to force her ownership of the farmhouse by physically altering the structure. Instead, she had just purchased $50,000 of unsecured debt. David would have to drain his retirement accounts to pay the contractors. Harper's lifestyle was finished. Sylvia had bankrupted her own household to build a room she would never be allowed to enter. "You have 30 minutes to get off my property," I told her. I did not scream the eviction. I did not need volume. The finality of the statement echoed off the antique hardwood floors. Sylvia opened her mouth to argue, to plead, to launch one last desperate volley of maternal guilt, but the words withered in her throat. She looked at the faces surrounding her. Aunt Linda was staring at the ceiling. Cousin Greg was inspecting his fingernails. Thomas and the other commercial tenants were standing tall, their expressions hardened into stony contempt. There was no audience left to manipulate. The stage was dark. My mother turned away. The departure was a portrait of total, humiliating defeat. David bent down and picked up the heavy silver ice bucket. The melted ice sloshed against the metal sides, a hollow, pathetic sound in the quiet room. Harper gathered the stack of unused plastic cups, her hands shaking so badly she dropped 2 onto the rug. She did not bother to pick them up. Sylvia walked toward the front door. Her posture was broken, her shoulders rounded, her chin tucked to her chest. She looked small. The towering, terrifying matriarch who had dictated the emotional weather of my entire life was reduced to a fragile, indebted woman walking out of a house she could never claim. They stepped onto the wraparound porch and descended the wooden stairs. The crunch of their shoes against the gravel driveway sounded unnaturally loud. Nobody followed them out. The extended family remained in the living room watching through the large front windows as David loaded the cooler into the back of their luxury crossover. Harper climbed into the passenger seat, pulling the sun visor down to hide her tear-streaked face. Sylvia got behind the wheel. She did not look back at the farmhouse. She started the engine and drove down the long, tree-lined avenue. The vehicle passed through the iron gates and disappeared down the county highway, leaving nothing but a faint cloud of white dust settling over the Nebraska soil. The ensuing weeks moved with a swift, clean efficiency. The legal contest David had threatened evaporated into the ether. Stripped of their attorney and facing catastrophic contractor debts, my parents possessed neither the capital nor the credibility to mount a challenge in probate court. Margaret Sterling filed the necessary paperwork, the judge stamped the approval, and the transition of assets concluded without a single delay. I stepped into my role as the landowner. I did not sell the 400 acres. I sat down at the heavy oak dining table with Thomas and the other commercial growers. We reviewed the soil yields, the market projections, and the existing lease agreements. I applied my decade of wealth management experience to the agricultural operation. We established a new crop rotation schedule, hedged against market drops, and increased the overall revenue of the farm by 15% in the first quarter alone. Every additional dollar went directly into an irrevocable trust fund established for Leo. The child whose bed was stolen to fund a vacation was now the sole beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar agricultural empire. The social fallout within the extended family played out exactly as I anticipated. The family group chat, once a thriving hub of gossip and coordinated attacks, went dormant. Then the private messages began to arrive. Aunt Linda sent a thick, embossed card in the mail. The handwritten note inside stretched for 3 pages. She offered groveling apologies, claiming she had been blinded by Sylvia's grief, insisting she never truly believed I was a greedy person. She asked if we could meet for coffee, suggesting it was time to let the past go and focus on healing. Cousin Greg sent long text messages echoing the same sentiment. He talked about forgiveness. He talked about how much Grandma Helen loved family unity. I read the letters. I read the text messages. I did not reply to a single one. I filed the cards in a desk drawer and deleted the digital threads. The extended relatives were seeking absolution. They wanted me to grant them a pardon so they could stop feeling guilty about their own complicity. They wanted to pretend the smear campaign was just a simple misunderstanding, a minor dispute that could be paved over with a warm cup of coffee and a forced smile. I refused to provide that comfort. A boundary is an interesting concept. People often confuse it with a punishment. They assume that if you lock a door, you are doing it to inflict pain on the people standing on the outside. But a true boundary has nothing to do with the people on the outside. It is about protecting the life you are building on the inside. My silence was not an act of revenge. It was a structural necessity. It was a legal document, a changed cylinder lock, and the unyielding refusal to set myself on fire to keep my family warm. The people who demanded I endure humiliation to maintain their comfort did not earn a seat at my table just because they finally realized I held the deed to the house. I learned that blood does not grant an automatic right of entry. Loyalty is demonstrated through actions, not demanded through shared genetics. Helen understood that truth. She spent her final days ensuring I possessed the tools to enforce it. The Nebraska autumn transitioned into a crisp, bright winter. I bundled Leo into a thick wool blanket and stepped out onto the wraparound porch of the farmhouse. The afternoon sun cast a long golden light across the dormant fields. The cottonwood trees rustled in the cold breeze, their bare branches scraping against the pale blue sky. I sat down in the heavy wooden rocking chair my grandmother had favored. I settled Leo against my chest, feeling the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat. I looked out over the sprawling acreage. There were no frantic text messages vibrating in my pocket. There were no demands for performative smiles. There was no chaotic energy waiting to dismantle my peace. There was only the sound of the wind moving over the frozen earth. I leaned back in the chair, closed my eyes, and listened to the profound, unbroken quiet of a life I finally owned. The concept of the American family is often painted in broad, comforting strokes. We are raised on the ideal of the family home as an impenetrable sanctuary, a place where loyalty is unconditional and support is freely given. We are taught that parents are the ultimate protectors, the architects of our moral foundation, and that siblings are our lifelong allies. But the story of Peyton Sylvia and the Nebraska farmhouse strips the warm, nostalgic paint right off the canvas. It forces us to look at the raw, untreated wood beneath and asks a deeply uncomfortable question. What happens when the people who are supposed to protect your sanctuary are the ones holding the matches? When we look closely at Sylvia, we see a tragic distortion of maternal responsibility. In modern American culture, there is a dangerous tendency to equate providing comfort with providing love. Sylvia believed she was being a good mother to Harper. She believed that by removing every obstacle, by funding luxury wellness retreats to soothe the bruised ego, she was demonstrating profound parental devotion. But shielding a child from the consequences of their own life is not an act of love. It is an act of sabotage. By stealing a newborn infant's bassinet to finance her adult daughter's tequila-soaked escape, Sylvia was not raising a capable woman. She was cultivating a permanent dependent. True family responsibility requires the courage to let your children feel the weight of the real world. It demands the implementation of fairness, teaching them that their desires do not supersede the basic needs of others. Sylvia sacrificed honesty and fairness on the altar of favoritism. She taught Harper that the rules of gravity did not apply to her, so long as there was someone else around to break her fall. And in doing so, she robbed her youngest daughter of the opportunity to develop resilience, emotional awareness, and a functional moral compass. When the safety net was finally cut away in that farmhouse living room, Harper did not know how to stand on her own 2 feet, because her mother had never allowed her to try. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we find Peyton. Peyton represents a role far too common in traditional family structures. She is the fixer, the responsible one, the child who does everything right, stays quiet, and inadvertently becomes the emotional shock absorber for the entire family's dysfunction. Traditional families sometimes fall into a very specific quiet trap. Parents praise the easy, independent child, and then they penalize that exact same child by demanding they carry the burdensome weight of the difficult sibling. We tell the responsible child to just keep the peace. We tell them to be the bigger person. But emotional awareness in parenting requires a mother and father to see all of their children clearly, not just the one making the most noise. When a family demands that one child continually bankrupt their own dignity to subsidize another child's entitlement, they are not teaching loyalty. They are teaching extortion. They are teaching the responsible child that their worth is intrinsically tied to their utility, and that their boundaries are merely suggestions waiting to be ignored. This is where the quiet brilliance of Grandma Helen serves as the ultimate masterclass in long-term guidance. Helen represents the truest form of generational stewardship. She sat on a floral sofa and watched the cancer of entitlement consume her daughter. She recognized that Sylvia's toxic brand of parenting was a threat not only to Peyton, but to the legacy of the family itself. Helen did not engage in a screaming match. She did not attempt to negotiate with a mind clouded by delusion. She understood that sometimes the most profound act of love a parent or grandparent can offer is an unyielding, absolute consequence. Helen used her last will and testament to deliver the parenting lesson Sylvia desperately needed but had actively avoided her entire life. She established that actions leave a permanent mark. She demonstrated that honesty matters, that theft carries a cost, and that you cannot build a sustainable legacy on a foundation of lies and manipulation. By completely disinheriting Sylvia and Harper, Helen was not being cruel. She was being just. She was protecting the vulnerable newborn great-grandson, and she was validating the grueling, silent sacrifices her eldest granddaughter had made for 30 years. Helen proved that real family responsibility is not about rewarding shared genetics. It is about rewarding shared character. The story of the Nebraska farmhouse is a mirror held up to the quiet corners of our own living rooms. It challenges us to evaluate the roles we play within our own bloodlines. Are we demanding peace at the expense of someone else's pain? Are we enabling the worst behaviors of the people we love simply because confronting them feels too exhausting? Breaking these generational cycles requires a terrifying amount of courage. It requires the willingness to look at the people who gave you life and realize that their authority is not absolute. It requires the strength to change the locks, to install the cameras, and to gather the receipts. It demands that we stop asking if we are being selfish and start asking what we want our children's tomorrow to look like. If you have ever found yourself standing in the hallway of your own life, holding the heavy weight of your family's expectations, and wondering when it will finally be your turn to rest, you are not alone. You belong here, with us. Subscribe to the Aura Vengeance channel. Join our community of ordinary people who are learning how to stop absorbing the damage and start claiming their space. We share these stories because the truth is contagious, and a boundary set by one person can inspire a fortress built by another. We spend our whole lives believing that a home is a place we are simply born into. We believe the walls are permanent, and the people inside them are entitled to our warmth, no matter how much cold air they drag through the door. But maybe a true home is something entirely different. Maybe a home is not an inheritance at all. Maybe it is just a quiet piece of ground where you finally decide to stand. A place where the air is clear, the ledgers are balanced, and the people who enter only do so because they know the value of the key. And as you sit in the quiet of your own life, listening to the wind rattle against the window glass, you might find yourself looking at the front door and wondering, who still holds a key to your peace? And is it finally time to change the lock?